So welcome to all of you to the big conversation on the global pandemic, global solutions, the UN we need now, a very relevant topic. I'm happy to see that we're joined by so many students this time around. My name is Eefke de Lauw, and we're very happy to have with us Dr. Alana O'Malley today. She is the head of the research group United Nations Studies, Peace and Justice, which is a very special research group as it's shared between The Hague University and the Faculty of of Governance, Law and Safety, as well as Leiden University, the Institute of Security and Global Affairs. So we're very happy that she can speak to us today. Alana O'Malley joined The Hague University in 2018. She has a PhD from the European University Institute in Italy, and she's a historian focusing on the United Nations, decolonization, Congo and the Cold War, among others. And we're very honored to have you with us, Alana. Before I hand over to you, just a few household rules. They're probably quite familiar already, but obviously we look forward to all of you participating. For now, I'd like to ask you to mute your microphones. I think all of you have done so. If for whatever reason you're experiencing any technical problems, then please let us know via the chat. In a few moments, I'm first going to hand over to Alana O'Malley, but there's plenty of room for questions and comments afterwards. It might work best if you just raise your hand, and then I can call upon you to ask your question or make your comment, or just type in your question in the chat, and we'll take it from there. So for now, I will stop sharing my PowerPoint, Alana, giving you the opportunity to upload your slides, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much for that very generous introduction, and I'm very happy to be joining you this afternoon. I'm just going to upload my slides here. Just 1 second. Okay. So they're just uploading now. So I'm very happy to be able to have this conversation with you this afternoon, and that so many of you have joined us. And so what I'm going to do is talk to you for about half an hour about the topic, and then I will take any questions you have at the end. So please do keep your questions till the end, and then we'll have some time for discussion. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yeah.
Excellent. And it's in full view, I hope.
It is. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you today about really is, as I'm Professor of UN Studies, I thought it would be an opportune moment to talk about the UN and the UN's performance in this time of the global pandemic. And it won't be any surprise to you to know that the UN, and particularly the World Health Organization, which is a UN body, has come in for a lot of criticism in how it has handled the global pandemic for the last 12 or 14 months. And at the same time, of course, there is a great imperative now for UN action on this question, because it's a global problem. It's a global pandemic. So no one state can design a solution. Indeed, even no one region can design a solution. So the scale of this problem is really and truly global, and which requires a global solution. But this also means that it requires global cooperation, and the best mechanisms and systems that we have for that are within the UN framework. So global pandemic, global solutions, the UN that we need now. And in thinking about that question of the UN we need now, I'm adopting some language from the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, which was last October. So to celebrate the 75th anniversary, 75 years of UN since 1945, the UN asked the world the future we want, the UN we need. So what kind of future organization do we need? And as part of that anniversary, then they celebrated 75 years by having dialogues around that UN we need. So I want you to keep that idea in mind. What are the changes and perhaps the criticisms you would have of the UN, and how would we deal with them? And we might be able to discuss some ideas at the end. So firstly, if we were there in the room, but I think we can still do it online, if I was to ask you what comes to mind immediately when you think of the UN, then most people present kind of some kind of stereotypical images, right? So you have this idea of peacekeepers, this idea of peacekeepers or diplomats who are working in the same room together, blue helmets in a conflict zone, or particularly vociferous and impactful diplomats. And I've given Samantha Power there as an example. She was Barack Obama's UN ambassador. So these are some of the typical stereotypical images that come to mind when we think about what the UN is. Now, these are accurate images. The UN is a peacekeeping organization. It does send men, mostly men, not only, but mostly men, in blue helmets to conflict zones to try to promote peace and to try to resolve conflict. As part of this, there are high-level negotiations between diplomats on the Security Council, and you see them pictured there. And this oftentimes ends up in quite vociferous debates between, especially the permanent 5 members, that is the United States, China, the US, Russia, and not the Soviet Union anymore, but Russia, France, and the UK. And so all of these images are accurate. But there's also a problem with these images, because the first thing people say is, this is what the UN does. And the second thing that they say is, well, the UN isn't very good at any of these things. So obviously we still have global conflict. Does this mean that peacekeeping doesn't work and that it's not effective? Obviously, we still have enormous global challenges, not just conflict and not just the pandemic, but huge challenges towards development, towards human rights. And so do high-level diplomats really achieve anything in their negotiations? And then the third thing is that a lot of people look at these kinds of images and say, well, you know, this isn't really relevant for me. So this is something that's very far away. It's in New York. It's kind of removed from my daily life. And so what the UN does doesn't matter. And so this is all very negative imagery. And it's not wrong, because these are all true statements of fact. The UN does these things and it doesn't do them very well. But it's a problem, because if the general public and students and academics and policymakers, if they're not interested in what the UN does and what it does well and what it does not do well, then there's a real lack of public connection. And that really obscures the work of the organization. And it also creates this problem of a lack of connection to the people that it's supposed to be working for. So that's kind of the problem that I'm trying to overcome in my research and in my teaching about the UN. And I'm trying to generate a solution. And that solution is a little bit less pretty than these images, because it looks like this. So this is the existing diagram of the UN system, and it's very boxy and it's not very attractive to the eye, but I wanted to draw your attention to it for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that you'll see there the orange box from the Security Council, and this is where those images of peacekeeping and diplomatic negotiation come from. And in any press coverage on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, anything that deals with the UN, it's mostly to do with its activities in this little orange box. But if you look at the green box, the blue box, and the yellow box, then you see that actually the UN has many more programs, funds, agencies, and departments that perform much more work. And this other work in the areas of economic and social development and the protection of human rights is much more impactful, it's much more successful, and it's actually much more directly affecting everyday lives, including our lives, even in developed places like the Netherlands. So to get a real impression of what the UN does, we have to take these other elements of the system into account. And that's very relevant for now because we're going to talk about the pandemic in just a minute. So how do we take them into account, right? We can't really look at all the funds and all the agencies, all the General Assembly committees and all the departments. That would be simply too much. Well, in thinking about that connection between the general public and the UN institutions and the UN system, we can talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure that you're aware of. So the Sustainable Development Goals are very lofty, and a lot of criticism that people have about them is that it's simply too ambitious, right? So even if we just take goal number 2 there, which is zero hunger, I mean, this seems like very lofty, very admirable. We should not have any hunger in our world, given the amount of food production that we have in kind of 2/3 of the spaces. But at the same time, it doesn't really seem very likely that we'll achieve by 2030 to have absolutely zero hunger in the world. So why does the UN create these ambitious targets? Well, they do that because they want to achieve these ambitions, but they also want to give all kinds of different government regimes a roadmap towards solving global problems. Because zero hunger doesn't just mean zero hunger in the Netherlands or zero hunger in Europe or zero hunger in the West or zero hunger in the global south. It means everywhere. So firstly, these goals are deliberately formulated to be ambitious and global in scope. But secondly, this is also a roadmap for governments to create sustainable policies on really important questions. And that's not just national governments, it goes towards regional organizations like the EU, like ECOWAS, like ASEAN. It goes towards even provincial authorities and municipal governments like the City of The Hague, which has generated policies around specific goals, particularly actually in The Hague, we're looking at, of course, goal 16, because it's a city of peace and justice. So these targets are designed to give an end goal towards those governing authorities to generate specific policies relevant for their context. And in that way, it's like a kind of a quilt, which is kind of how it looks. And it kind of brings together different levels of governance, all generated towards working towards these ambitious goals, if not hopefully achieving them. Now, where does that kind of leave us with the pandemic? Because obviously the pandemic addresses goal number 3, quite obviously, but maybe also others, right? So if we think about goal number 13, goal number 14, goal number 15, goal number 10, goal number 9 perhaps, goal number 11, goal number 12. So we see the pandemic actually touches on quite a lot of the Sustainable Development Goals, because yes, it's a global health pandemic, but in the politics of the pandemic that we've seen unfold, actually a lot of other issues come to the surface. Certainly, climate action, life below water, life on land, they're all connected to how the pandemic has emerged and how it has been managed. If we think about goal number 10, reduce inequalities, well, we're talking about the access of different communities to the vaccine and towards good healthcare where the COVID vaccine or the COVID virus has been contracted. Goal number 11 and goal number 12 are about how we manage that process of access to global healthcare systems to create infrastructure around communities, to create healthcare infrastructure. Global responsible consumption is also related in how we consume and manage our lockdown lives, right? And the kind of production of output that we have during that time. So maybe actually the Sustainable Development Goals is directly relevant to the global pandemic. Before we get into some of those questions about vaccine politics, I wanted to introduce you to the WHO a little bit more closely. So I'm sure that we've all seen a lot of images coming from Geneva, which is where the WHO is based, in the last year. I think obviously the organization has never gotten so much global public attention. And to a large extent, I'm sorry, my image seems to be frozen, but I'm still here. So to a large extent, that coverage has been pretty mixed, right? So we've had a lot of attention towards what does the WHO actually do, which is good for increasing its connection and relevance to global populations. But we've also had a lot of criticism, especially of the head of the WHO, and towards the politics of the relationship with China. So I'm going to get into that in a minute. But just to give you a kind of a sense more neutrally of what it does, the WHO, based in Geneva, has 6 regional offices and 150 field offices, which means that the WHO works in almost all of the 193 member states of the UN. Now, that's a pretty massive scope for an organization in managing global public healthcare. The budget for 2021 was 8.4 billion US dollars. So this is a considerable budget. Now, this year it has more money because of the pandemic, but you see, this is there's serious resources here in tackling global health problems. And it's really designed to try to make sure that everybody has access to universal healthcare and the highest possible standards of health for the global population. One of the big achievements of WHO is that they eradicated smallpox in 1977, but they also do a lot of other things before the pandemic came along. So they're working a lot on malaria, they work a lot on HIV in sub-Saharan Africa, they work a lot on polio. Obviously, they manage any kind of serious outbreak of a global health crisis. The Ebola crisis a couple of years ago in Sierra Leone comes to mind. But also for us, what does it do for us in Europe? And we have a pretty good healthcare system here in the Netherlands. So what benefits would we get from the WHO? Well, even before the pandemic, it was the WHO's advice for the Netherlands that everybody should get the flu vaccine. And they got that advice, or they generated that advice on the basis of research that those WHO scientists did about how flu affects populations, even in developed countries, because it affects the differences in equity between who has access to education, who has access to healthcare. But it also looks at the problems, the long-term problems and the impact on healthcare systems that flu cases cause, even in developed economies, because flu cases rise during the winter and they put more pressure on national health systems. So this is the kind of advice that the WHO was doling out until, of course, last year. Now, just before I talk about the pandemic, I want to just give you a little bit of extra background. So I've mentioned that 193 member states are what constitutes the UN members, but I also want to draw your attention to the UN Charter. So Article 1.3 really urges that international problems of economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian in character are tackled by the UN, which means that these problems of economic and social development and healthcare access are equal in importance in the UN's mandate to conflict resolution. And we've seen how important that is in the last year in our efforts to tackle the problem. The other thing I want to emphasize is that 2/3 of the UN's members since 1960 are from the Global South, which means that all these organizations within the UN and also the WHO is not dominated by Western powers, they're dominated by Global South countries. And this is really important because it means that on the one hand, the UN is the most dynamic and representative international organization in existence. There is no other organization that is equal to the scope, the scale, the legitimacy and the relevance of the UN, but it also means that actually a lot of the dialogue around these global questions is not generated by the United States or by Western countries. That's what we hear in our media, but actually most of the membership is made up by Global South countries who are disproportionately affected by low levels of economic and social growth and also by abuse of human rights. So bear that context in mind as we turn now to look at the COVID-19 pandemic. So firstly, I wanted to take you through what has the UN actually done in the pandemic. Well, Tedros Ghebreyesus, who is the head of the WHO, I think he's also going to be very familiar to you now. He's been all over the media really for the last year. He kind of stamped his mark on this pandemic. In January, February last year, the WHO started to make a lot of public statements about this. And then eventually in March, they declared a global pandemic, which means that this disease is all over the world. So this we know already. Now, from February onwards, the UN could not convene a meeting of the Security Council. So the Security Council, thinking back to our first slide of that classic image of the diplomats, is made up of the 5 permanent members, the United States, Russia, China, France and Britain, and 10 elected members, which are drawn from the other regions. Now, during those months between February, March, and April, as the global pandemic raged around the world and hundreds of thousands of people started to become infected and some began to die, the Security Council members could not agree to discuss this in public. Why was that? Well, a lot of it was to do with the fact that the United States really started a dialogue about how this was a Chinese disease. It had come from Wuhan. There was these crazy rumors about a leak from a lab in Wuhan. This had been genetically engineered. So there was a lot of really trite discourse going on, led by the Trump administration. And this really had the effect that China refused to negotiate in public about the pandemic. And the statements that we saw from China at that time was that they had the situation under control, and it was the European countries that were really not having any control over the pandemic. So this was a very bad period of politics, because although there's a lot of pressure from the international community for the Security Council to declare the pandemic a threat to peace and security, remember that peace and security questions are the only ones discussed at the Security Council. So all the other organs that we looked at, they can only really talk about economic and social issues and human rights, which are not unpolitical, but they're not within that tight definition of peace and security, not normally considered. So peace and security issues are mostly in the Security Council, and it took 3 months before the members could agree that the COVID-19 pandemic was a threat to peace and security, which it is, because once there's a pandemic, all the normal security apparatus becomes a lot more difficult to organize, to manage. Conflicts escalated in the short term because the pandemic really limited the ability of observers and peace operations to continue, limited the ability of militaries to be more effective. Also, the pandemic created greater humanitarian crises because people started to get sick. So access to healthcare, even in well-developed countries where there was no conflict, and Italy very much comes to mind, became a massive problem. So this was what was going on in the spring last year. The WHO during that period was greatly criticized for their approach to China. And there was a lot of negative conversation, some of it quite well justified, that the WHO really didn't kind of square up to China quick enough to say what's going on, what are the numbers, give us the origins of this, because they were trying to trace the outbreak of the pandemic in order to generate research for vaccines. So the WHO took a softly approach to China, so they were heavily criticized. After that, the UN Secretary General, who's pictured there at the bottom, Antonio Guterres, called for a global ceasefire. So he gave this quite impassioned message in April last year, talking about, we really need to have a global ceasefire because this is a global pandemic. So we can't have any more military conflicts. We need to bond together. So he called on the member states to unite, to work together to generate a solution, to share their research for vaccines, to cooperate for logistics, supply lines, access to PPE, all that stuff that had been taken for granted was suddenly in turmoil. And at the root of that, he also pointed to the fact that this was a time for all kind of conflict to cease, because this was really a huge humanitarian catastrophe. So we started to see then over the summer last year and into the autumn, the coordination of global responses. So we saw great regional coordination between regional organizations, but also at the UN, in the WHO, you had regionally generated responses towards vaccine research, logistical supply of PPE materials, healthcare support. You saw even in the Netherlands, so some patients in the east get sent to German hospitals to ease the burden on the Dutch healthcare system. I'm sure that was reciprocal, so I'm sure that they were then able to provide something else to the Germans in turn. So these type of small scale and large scale global responses become more coordinated and also more cooperative. So the WHO's kind of esteem kind of starts to rise a little bit again in the autumn, because they're really managing this global response, and they're trying to coordinate between the member states to speed up access to the production of the vaccine, and since then, of course, to speed up the Not so much the production of the vaccine, but the distribution of the vaccine. So where does it go? How many countries get access when, etc., etc. At the same time, they've started an official investigation into the outbreak of the coronavirus in Wuhan. And so that's also an effort then to mediate a little bit more with the Chinese to get more information. The most recent development of the Security Council on this has been in February, when they called for a sustained humanitarian pause. Now, that has not been successful. If you look at what's happening even today in Crimea, in Syria, of course, in the Tigray region, in Ethiopia, there is no humanitarian pause, unfortunately. So we still have this problem that the economic and social and humanitarian impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has not translated to greater multilateral cooperation on peace and security issues. There was perhaps a temporary cessation in the early part of the spring last year when the pandemic was declared, but that has not lasted. So where does that kind of take us up to? Well, what's happened really is that there's been an increasing politicization of economic and social development. And if we looked back, and we a really interesting research project for one of you, if you're interested in doing it, looking back to try to trace how economic and social development and the work of the WHO has become increasingly politicized during this crisis. And I think this comes out very well in this speech from Dr. Mike Ryan of the WHO. And this went viral a couple of weeks ago when he gave this speech to an Irish charity in February. And you really see, I think, a lot of anger in the WHO's, approach to how countries have responded to solving the crisis and to their limited coordination in their effort to solve it, but also in where this virus has come from. And that's going to be the next conversation. So once we have the vaccine situation solved, we're going to have a huge discussion and I think another kind of conflict about where the coronavirus actually came from and why that has happened and how it became global in scale. So I've just got a short clip here and hopefully you'll be able to see and hear it, and please let me know if you can't.
We are pushing nature to its limit. We're pushing population to its limit. We're pushing communities to their limits. We're stressing the environment. We're stressing populations and communities. We are creating the conditions in which epidemics flourish. We're forcing and pushing people to migrate away from their homes because of climate stress. We're doing so much, and we're doing it in the name of globalization and some sense of chasing that wonderful thing that people call economic growth. Well, in my view, that's becoming a malignancy, not growth. Because what it's doing is driving unsustainable practices in terms of how we manage communities, how we manage development, how we manage prosperity. We are generating, we're writing checks that we cannot cash as a civilization for the future. And they're going to bounce. And my fear is that our children are going to pay that price. That someday when we're not here, our children will wake up in a world where there is a pandemic that has a much higher case fatality rate and that could bring our civilization to its very knees. We need a world that's more sustainable, where profit is not put before communities, where that is not the bottom line, where the slavery to economic growth is taken out of the equation. We need sustainable growth in our communities. We need sustainable livelihoods for our people. And we are taking huge risks, and I mean massive risks, with our future if we don't manage the biome that we live in on the planet in which we live. And we're being extremely irresponsible right now.
Right, so that's tough words there. And you see that this is quite emotive for Mike Ryan and for the WHO. But what it also shows us is that this is the direction of the conversation, this question of where did the coronavirus come from? Now, viruses can mutate. We know scientifically that they emerge from the interaction between the human world and the animal world. But also, how did it get to this point and how is it so out of control? And a lot of the underlying sentiment of what he's arguing there is that this has happened because of this kind of unfettered pressure for globalization, for movement of peoples and goods, for the the kind of pursuit of that capitalist dream for unfettered economic growth and all that goes with it. And that is what has made this a global pandemic that could not be limited by any country in the world. Every single country in the world is affected by the coronavirus, even in North Korea, though we may never know the scale of the devastation there. And so this kind of tells us that the world is extremely interconnected, but also that we have something to answer to in how not just the crisis has been managed, but the fact that we've created the conditions for its emergence in the first place. And the WHO in these statements, has become increasingly critical of the member states, but also has become increasingly political in its response. And this really kind of signals, I think, a change in the tone of the organization as they grapple with trying to solve this in the face of really obstructionist politics from a lot of the member states. And this is really the next thing I want to talk about, which is this question of vaccine politics and the UN response. So we know that the WHO has sought to coordinate, as I said, not the production of the vaccine, but the distribution of the vaccine. And they want to coordinate it north and south rather than simply, within Europe or within any particular space. And so a couple of months ago, something called the COVAX initiative was created by the WHO, the Vaccine Alliance and Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness. And what they're trying to do is to coordinate the distribution of the vaccine evenly between the north and south, right? So it's not just rich countries that have access to the vaccine, but it's also lower income countries or less developed areas, because peoples in those places tend to have less access to good healthcare, and also the conditions of many societies mean that coronavirus can spread a lot more easily because they don't have the same access to clean drinking water or indeed PPE in hospitals. So this is really a global problem, because as long as the virus survives anywhere, we all have to live in this kind of lockdown world. But at the same time, unless we coordinate the distribution of the vaccine, there's no point vaccinating everybody in the Netherlands, because you have to have everybody in the world vaccinated. Otherwise, we can't resume life as we know it. So COVAX was created between those public and private partners to try to coordinate this distribution of the vaccine, and also to try to, if you like, alleviate the effects of north-south politics. You see then also within this is that there's a great call for vaccine equity. As I said, that this vaccine is equally distributed, but also that this is kind of coming out more and more when we see the effects of the vaccine, that the vaccine is the most positive benefits of the vaccine are also equally distributed, so that we don't just give the vaccines that we're doubtful for towards less developed countries, but that actually everybody has access to the best quality of vaccine. But these politics are playing out between the member states. And we see this even in Europe, where the United States has a great vaccine record, but they have exported no vaccines. So the United States, when you look at those images of people queuing up to get their vaccine, it's very impressive. But remember that they have only vaccinated their own people. So they've not given any vaccines to other countries. The European Union is having another problem because there's a scramble between the member states. And we saw this in the UK, where the UK also does not want to export the vaccine that they're producing, the AstraZeneca vaccine, to the EU, even under those agreements, because they want it for their own people. And this kind of nationalization of the vaccine is a big problem. But the thing to remember is that the European Union has still exported in the region of 30 to 40% of the vaccines that are produced here to the global south. So you need coordinating regional bodies to manage this that are above the politics of member states, because obviously every member state wants to vaccinate all its people. But if you bear that global scale in mind, it's pointless to vaccinate everybody in one state, because it doesn't really eradicate the virus at all. It simply makes day-to-day lives a little bit more easy, but not even in the long term, because we don't know that the vaccine works, for more than a year without a top-up, etc., etc. So these vaccine politics between the member states are extremely damaging, but it makes the role of the COVAX initiative and the WHO imperative in managing those distribution politics. And ultimately what we see, and Mike Ryan kind of hints on that as well, is this balance between, on the one hand, there's this pressure for economic recovery, because of course we can't live in this lockdown environment forever. There have been devastating impacts on sectors of the economy, the hospitality sector in particular. But I think also, like, if we think about even student jobs, right? I mean, I'm sure that many of you have been affected by your part-time job is simply not available anymore. If you worked in a bar or a restaurant, you can have some compensation from the government, but it's not really the same thing as going out and earning money. And even on the very immediate level, we see the economic impact of the pandemic, even in a developed society like the Netherlands, is quite significant. So there's a balance between how do we alleviate the negative economic impact of a lockdown in response to trying to stop the virus from spreading, and at the same time manage local healthcare systems so that people, if they do get sick, will have access to an ICU bed in the worst case scenario, and that our healthcare system isn't completely overburdened. And this is the balance that's playing out in every single member state right now of the UN. And on top of that, there is kind of the global scale, which is where, again, the role of the WHO and the UN more broadly comes into play in trying to alleviate the problems that are created on the national level. So what kind of UN, where are we with the UN that we need right now? Well, firstly, the pandemic has been both positive and negative for the UN. So as I said, it has increased attention towards the UN's work in economic and social development. So we definitely know now a lot more in the public image, in the public mind, about what the WHO actually does. It's been very revealing of the work they do being quite important, but it's also been quite negative, and we see how politics really plays into essential economic and social development, even in managing healthcare, and that's kind of it's also kind of problematic that we now have a very full view of the kind of the ugly side of vaccine distribution. And it's not just a humanitarian thing that's very far away from us, it's actually immediate to everybody in the world right now. So yeah, it has exposed those fractures of global politics too, in that everything has become inherently politicized. And that politicization actually means that it's much harder to manage the pandemic, because countries are not thinking about the big scale, they're thinking only of the local political impact. We also see this kind of, I would say, emergent but also growing tension between environmental protection and global capitalism. So as I said, I think this is going to be the next stage of the debate around the pandemic. Once we have rolled out, kind of a vaccine to everybody, then everybody in the world, then we're going to see these questions, about environmental protection, sustainable environmental practices, the interaction between the animal and the human world, and the consequences of this global capitalist system and the impact that it's had on our planet, because that is what has produced this pandemic. So the question really becomes then, is this a moment of opportunity for multilateralism, where states really realize that multilateralism has to be more than a rhetoric? It has to be a practice, because we can't solve this problem of a global pandemic without global cooperation? Or is it a moment of really nationalization, where countries turn inwards and they're like, no, this is a problem we'll solve on our own. We're giving the vaccine to all our citizens first, and the rest of the world can wait. So this is a real tension that exists, and it's really a kind of, the outcome of this question is really whether or not the UN and the WHO can be effective in solving the crisis, and whether or not the member states enable that agency and they help them to do more to solve the problem. So I'll leave you there with the talk. We still have some time for questions. If you want to get involved in UN studies more broadly, that's my email there. I also created a student society called UN Youth Impact, and I hope that you've already heard of it. If not, then please look us up. There's a Facebook page and there's simply a website, and they're on Twitter. And UN Youth Impact is a student-run society that tries to break down global questions and take an activist approach towards developing local strategies for big global issues that the UN deals with. So please come along and get involved in that. Thanks very much for listening for so long, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Alana, for a very insightful talk. I'm sure that there are many burning questions or comments on all of your minds. So just open up the floor for discussion. So any questions or any comments that you would like to raise? Just feel free to raise your hand or type in your question in the chat. I think that's one of our colleagues, Peter Hansen. Please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm quite interested to hear what your view is on to what extent the WHO has also itself to blame for the loss of its status, or has that contributed to the politicization of its role or its loss of credibility, or is it purely because of the big states like China and the US getting into a conflict with each other?
Yeah, thanks. I kind of anticipated that somebody would ask that question. And I think there's three things to bear in mind about this, and this is how I would view it, is that the WHO is only as powerful or as effective as the member states enable it to be. So like all international organizations, it has a limited agency in and of itself. Now, there is an argument to suggest that if they had acted more quickly in declaring a global pandemic, that actually it would have alleviated the effect of the pandemic, because states would have closed borders more quickly and there would have been, a quicker national response. But the WHO cannot independently declare anything. Everything, all of those statements that you see coming from Tedros and coming from Mike Ryan, most of it is not off the cuff. It's all negotiated before with the member states about what they can say and what they are legitimately kind of agreeing to. And so they knew that declaring a global pandemic would have economic consequences, and quite significant economic consequences. So I believe that behind the scenes there was quite a lot of pressure not to declare a global pandemic until the situation reached a certain point. So that you have to kind of always bear in mind that the agency of these organizations is limited by the member states who fund them. So all of their funding comes from the big countries, especially from China and from the United States. So this is one element to kind of bear in mind. Now, on the other hand, I do agree with you that the WHO at the same time should have been perhaps more provocative and been more effective with what it was telling people. We know that a lot of the global pandemic is about the actions of individuals. So if we keep washing our hands, it does make a difference to the national problem of the pandemic in the Netherlands. WHO could have gotten that message across a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. But then the final thing I think to bear in mind, of course, is that I think that they've learned a bit of a lesson in this, and you see that because these speeches are becoming increasingly politicized. So that clip from Mike Ryan, that's not scripted, right? That's a bit off the cuff for him. This is what he really thinks about the pandemic, and that's, I think, probably why it went viral. And you see also in the clips from Tedros Ghebreyesus that he becomes increasingly agitated over time, and that's why it would be such a great research project, just even in to look at the discourse of the WHO changing over the last 12 months, because I think there has been increased polarization, and they're trying to be stronger and to strike more at the larger member states who constrained their agency in the beginning.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, of course, it raises the question about the leadership itself and whether that leadership has been strong enough, credible enough, or has had lost credibility earlier on as a leadership because of his actions or the comments that he made. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks.
There's another question in the chat for you, Alana, which is about the veto power in the Security Council. The question is, do you think it is a problem that 5 countries have the veto power, Doesn't that undermine the principle of equality and equal sovereignty of all member states?
Yeah, I mean, this question comes up quite a lot. Yes, of course, the veto problem is it's a huge issue. It means that the Security Council is not representative on the votes on big peace and security questions. But the veto system, you have to remember, allows for Russia to sit at the table with the United States and with China, and there's no other space in which these countries sit together and negotiate. So it is a problem, and I think that it certainly limits the effectiveness of the Security Council. But it keeps these countries in dialogue with each other, and that's really important. Even if you look at what's happening in Crimea right now over the last 24 hours, then you have to be able to dialogue with Russia to keep them engaged in the debate. And that also goes for questions like the Uyghurs in China. If China is not even at the Security Council meeting when these things are discussed, then it's almost totally ineffective. So it is a lot about keeping these powers engaged with each other. The second element, I think, to remember about the veto problem is that it doesn't mean that these countries cannot be confronted with the questions that they don't want to talk about. So sometimes it takes a long time to get something like the Uyghurs onto the Security Council agenda, but it does mean that it's an opportunity to kind of publicly confront a lot of those powers with their questions that they don't want to talk about. And that's very, very important. So the public element of debate at the Security Council has an effect on the prestige of its members, but also it's very revealing of how they manage their systems and how they manage their politics and how they manage these questions of human rights and peace and security. So the veto power, it's, obviously we would recreate the UN without the veto, but then you'd have to have a kind of a get out of jail free card for those great powers, because otherwise they're not incentivized to really sit at the table and be bashed in public on those issues. So unfortunately, it's the best of what we have right now. Thanks.
Okay, you see some more questions coming in as well. This next question is how you see the connection between private interests of the vaccine manufacturers and the goal of an equal production and distribution of the vaccine. Would it make sense to sort of pause the patent on the vaccines?
Super interesting question. And I mean, this is I think this is also another issue that's grossly under-researched in how the UN operates, which has been the role of private corporations over time. This has been going on since since 1945, but I mean, certainly in the League of Nations before it. What influence do private industry and private companies have over something like vaccine production? And I think that there's a real balance of interest here. So you saw this kind of coming out in January in that row that went on between the European Commission and the producers of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And a lot of the row was the European Commission accused the AstraZeneca of not holding agreement to their production timeline, because AstraZeneca, they turned around and said, well, we're not going to send all these vaccines that we agreed. And then there was a claim that, well, actually, it's a British vaccine. And the European Union came back and said, well, we have provided you with the materials to make the vaccine, so it's a European vaccine. So there's a lot of really interesting politics over ownership of these vaccines. I think it would make sense to pause the patent. I think by doing that, you take this whole question of profit from vaccines out of the equation. Remember that the leading pharmaceutical companies are also driving this process. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a very good example of that. They stand to make huge amounts of money from this. This is private capital. This is not public capital. This is not money that would be invested in global healthcare systems, in the UN, in WHO, in anything that would actually alleviate the pandemic. And certainly there is a very delicate balance between keeping up good enough relationships with those private corporations that control a lot of these resources so that they stay engaged in public vaccine production, but also at the same time balancing that with equal distribution of the vaccine. So it's a very good question. And again, bags of research potential on that, not just with healthcare vaccines. Yeah, I'd be also interested to hear your own views.
Yeah, so maybe I'm not sure who posed the question. Maybe you would like maybe have a point you would like to share as well. This is I only see your last name, unfortunately, is Grooshanten. Go ahead. What's your first name? Don't think we can hear you.
I'm sorry, does it now work?
Ah, yes, yes,
Okay.
there you are.
Yeah, thank you for your opinion. I honestly share that opinion. I don't know how feasible it is to pause the patent, since like the state doesn't really, work in the private sector there. In Germany, at least, where I'm from, the state bought a lot of shares of BioNTech, so they kind of have a thing going on there. But yeah, it's a difficult topic, definitely.
Yeah.
Super, thank you so much. And we have one other question from Liana, who's maybe a little bit related to the one you just answered. Question is, how do you think domestic political pressure to vaccinate own people first affects the plans to make sure North and South have equal access to quality vaccines?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it greatly affects this North-South balance, because obviously everybody wants a vaccine. There's nobody, I'm sure there's nobody on this call who, would not want to have a vaccine and for life to go back to normal. I think the thing to bear in mind is that it's kind of, as I said, if everybody in the Netherlands had a vaccine, great, but that would not mean that things would go back to normal, because as long as this pandemic exists anywhere in the world, you're still going to have restricted travel, restricted movement. The vaccine, we think at the moment, does not prevent community transmission, which means that people will still get sick, it'll still spread, it'll still produce mutations and variants that the vaccine may not be effective for. So I think national governments are trying to bear this global scale in mind and balance it with gradual rollout of the vaccine, because there is no national solution. So domestic pressure, yeah, it's in my view, this is one of the examples of national politics that actually is subservient to international concerns, because there can be all the domestic pressure in the world for a vaccine, but there's no point in vaccinating everybody here if our neighbors in Germany and in sub-Saharan Africa are not also vaccinated, because it doesn't mean that they'll be returned to normal. And frankly, I think also what often gets lost in this debate is that, we have to be individually responsible here. There's no point, in my view, protesting on the streets about, not having access to a vaccine, when, a lot of people have been negatively affected by the lockdown. That's true. And there's been great economic hardship created by it. But ultimately, we still have had people dying from this disease. Family members of, people that we may know. We have a lot of people who got sick. And we don't know the long-term impact of long COVID or the long-term effects. So this is really an individual responsibility where we choose to put our own immediate needs aside and try to be in this kind of global cooperative mindset where we wait for our turn so that everybody can have access to the vaccine at the right time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's just really calling about or making sure that we all take our responsibility and act as ethical global citizens. Maybe a last question for today. There's one question coming in the chat as well from someone who says he or she, I'm sorry I don't see your first name, is wondering how international organizations like WHO can deal with countries that still deny or don't take the pandemic seriously and don't impose any measures.
Yeah, and I think that the questioner asked, gives the example of Brazil. I think there's two things to bear in mind about those countries. Firstly, leaders like Bolsonaro and Trump, who go about pretending that this pandemic isn't real, they had short-term popularity for those views because of the hardships created by the lockdown that was imposed in response to the pandemic. But what we have seen over time that popularity has waned because the vaccine, the coronavirus doesn't really care whether you're a Bolsonaro supporter or not. And we saw that kind of misinformation about not wearing a mask and about it not being no worse than a flu has been proven false. And we see that not just in lesser developed countries, but on our doorstep here in the Netherlands. So I think that kind of populist politics around anti-vaccination or around coronavirus not being real, I think it was a bit of a flash in the pan, to be perfectly honest with you. And I think that even in places, in countries that didn't impose strict conditions, a lot of people responded by being individually responsible as much as possible. The second thing to bear in mind, of course, is that those populist leaders do it for their own politics and for their own popularity and for their own position, for their own power, and they don't do it as a kind of responsible statesmanship. And that means that we saw even in Brazil that a lot of regional governors did impose healthcare warnings and advice to wear a mask and lockdowns, because they knew that this was a serious problem. And Brazil is a good example because now they're in a very, very, very difficult situation with regard to how the coronavirus has affected their population. So I think that really exposes the fiction of a lot of that populist blunder and bluster around the whole kind of coronavirus debate. So I think you have to keep in mind that behind every populist idiot, there's usually responsible statesmen and women who try to follow WHO guidelines to best protect their populations.
Okay, thank you so much, Alana, for your time and answering the questions from all of us. Maybe we can all give you like a digital applause. You can use the emoticon there. So thank you so much. A very, very insightful story, and would like to share the recording of this on our YouTube channel for the Center of Expertise. So you can also watch the recording back. I think a lot of food for thought and a very relevant topic in this day and age. I can imagine that being a researcher in UN studies, these are fascinating times for you to see the organization in action. Thank you so much, Alana, and thank you everyone for joining us on this afternoon. Hope to see you again at the next big conversation. For now, we just say goodbye to you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Stop the recording.